pay no attention to me. I was asked to introduce Wayne and given 3 minutes, of which I've already used 15 seconds. An indication of the regard that I have for Wayne Flynt is the fact that this is the third time since Memorial Day that I have put on long pants. The first time was a meeting at the State Archives. The second time was going to church. And the third time is here. Now, if this suggests to you that I see some sort of connection between the state of Alabama and doing things with the state of Alabama, worshiping the Lord in the beauty of holiness, and Wayne Flynt, you're right. It's really, you know, how do you introduce someone that everybody knows? Here's one. So I'm going to tell a little story. When I returned to Alabama after a 25-year expatriation in Georgia and Florida, I wrote a little article for the Mobile Press Register when Bailey Thompson was putting together his critique of the Alabama Constitution. And in this article, I pointed out, what all of you know, that the Alabama Constitution was written by rich and powerful people determined to keep their wealth and power and to make sure that the rest of Alabamians were poor and powerless. I get a letter from a lady down in South Alabama who took me to task for the horrible things that I said about our founding fathers. Even though I pointed out that if you look at history, they are probably the most successful of all our politicians because they got what they wanted. So anyway, she wrote me this letter, and she told me that, you know, that I had really besmirched Alabama. She raised some questions about whether or not my parents had married. And she ended it with and she also suggested that maybe I should have stayed in Georgia. But she ended it with what she thought was the unkindest cut of all. When she said, if I continued on the path which I was going, I would probably end up like that Wayne Flynt. I wrote her back and I told her, because my mama taught me always respond to, I wrote her back, thanked her for her letter. And I said that if by any chance I ended up like that Wayne Flynt, it would be the best thing that ever happened to me. If we all ended up like that Wayne Flynt, it'd be the best thing that happened to Alabama. And so it is my pleasure this evening to introduce to you the guy you already know, that Wayne Flynt.
I have a confession with which to begin. I told Hardy Jackson that if he took long enough introducing me for me to finish my strawberry shortcake, that I would say he was the best historian of Alabama history, despite what it would do to my royalties. And so he is, and he is a stand-up comic as well, and a person of great moral conscience, who, despite his age, has a son who's going to be a freshman at Auburn University this year. I couldn't help but think, as I talked with you before we began tonight, of a story involving the late President John F. Kennedy, who decided, I think probably at the inspiration of his wife, to have all of the American Nobel Prize winners to the White House for dinner. The story goes that William Faulkner excused himself from the dinner, and when asked by colleagues in the English department at the University of Virginia why any sane person would not go to the White House to be honored in that company by the President of the United States, responded that driving from Charlottesville to Washington was just too far to go for dinner. But the others who did go were introduced by President Kennedy in a wonderful and famous remark, which no doubt many of you have heard, and which I confess is the first thought I had as I talked to you tonight. He began the conversation by saying that this was the greatest gathering of brilliance in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I'm pretty sure that's true here tonight. I just have a few questions to raise and about which to muse. How are we shaped into who we are? And to answer the question, I want to tell a story. The story is a biblical story, and you will understand more about the importance of the story anon. Gideon was an Old Testament military leader who had a vision, or perhaps he was old enough just to dream about youth. And the vision was that God had called him to save his people. And so whether a young man or an old man, he gathered an army and headed out into battle. On the way to the battle, he had another vision. And in this vision, the voice of God said, "Gideon, the army is too large. And if you carry this army into battle, and if you triumph, the people will think the triumph is due to them and not to me. So I want you to reduce the size of the army." It turned out the army was obviously a draft army because Gideon offered the soldiers a chance to go home if they wanted, and discovered that actually most of the soldiers had some urgent business back home and left. But with this greatly reduced army, he had yet another vision, and the vision was that the army was still too large. And so there was a test, and the question was, how do you drink water if you're a hungry, thirsty army? And those who did not pay attention to their surroundings as they drank the water were dismissed to go home as well. Having begun this story in some anxiousness of spirit, Gideon was now in deep anxiety about the future. And like most of us, he had his foot in both camps. There was the camp of faith in the providence of God, and there was even more faith in the reality of military conquest, or to put it in the words of Napoleon, God fights on the side that has the largest battalions. And so Gideon, no doubt, answering the vision by saying, "Say what?" nonetheless was faithful to his task, and as we know, delivered his people. Gideon is a good metaphor for where I want to go with my story. Victory does not, in fact, always go to the side that has the largest battalions. If so, I would prefer tonight to be speaking to the Alabama legislature or Alpha and not to you. Sometimes the victory goes to those who are most committed to the cause in which they believe. Not because someone pays them to believe it, but because someone has seen a vision or dreamed a dream. I would like to go into battle tonight with 4.5 million Alabamians and 51% of the Alabama legislature. That, regrettably, is not my fate. So I will gladly settle for the 100 people in this room and the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, that I've met across this state who are just like you. A new kind of Alabama, a new kind of America. Not a blue America or a red America. Not one wherein the interesting configuration of the tables protects you from people unlike yourselves, but blends you with people whose ideological and political positions are in fact quite different from yours. Jews, Pentecostals, evangelicals, high church Episcopalians, and people who don't have much faith they can boast of at all. And so my exegesis of this biblical story is not necessarily the way most Alabamians would interpret the biblical story. In fact, in matters of religion, as in interpretation of history, we always read our sacred text in order either to validate our existing culture or in amazing and subtle ways to separate ourselves from our prevailing culture. So how did our story, you, and my story, me, begin? In 1936, William Faulkner, back to Bill again, wrote a novel which is still, I think, one of the greatest American novels of all time, entitled Absalom, Absalom. I read it again in Italy on our 50th wedding anniversary, and I don't recommend it. For our 50th wedding anniversary. In the novel, 19-year-old Quentin Compson is in his freshman year at Harvard, and his roommate is a man by the name of Shreve McCannon, a Canadian who has never been to the South, knows nothing about the South, but becomes mesmerized by Quentin Compson's story of the bizarre and Gothic world of Jefferson, Yocnataha County, Mississippi. As Quentin Compson narrates this compelling story of self-destruction and family dysfunction, McCannon becomes so energized about the story that he can't wait to hear the next installment. And so on a cold night, McCannon keeps Quentin Compson up late into the night, beyond midnight, telling the story. Sucked deeper and deeper with every line of the story, he finally urges Compson to hurry to the punchline by saying, "Tell about the South. What's it like there? What do they do there? Why do they live there? Why do they live at all?" There's a book that grows out of this quotation. And the book is called Telling About the South. And that's what I want to try to do about you and me. You, even if you're an honorary Southerner, John Reed says, after living here 5 years, you are one, whether you know it or not. So let's just limit the narrative to those of us in the room. I know many of you well enough to know you fit my narrative perfectly. Some of you I don't know so well. So I'll just tell the story about myself and let you put yourself into the story wherever you want. In the beginning, there was the family. Not a family of movers and shakers, I absolutely assure you. A family of poor, hot-tempered, proud, hard-working, upwardly mobile, aspiring people. My grandfather came from a good family, a plantation family in High Falls, Georgia, but born after the war, mother died at birth, father remarried a stepmother he didn't like, couldn't get along with his siblings, and they lost everything in Reconstruction. And so Granddad grew up unable to read and write, and ultimately a sharecropper at Shady Glen in Calhoun County. Dad, after a bout of osteomyelitis that nearly cost him his leg and took him out of school for 2 years, the world of a 19-year-old in an 11th grade class in rural Alabama was not an easy life. And so after one of his many run-ins with a teacher, they kicked him out of school. Dad said, well, it was time to leave anyway, and so he was off to Birmingham to work in a steel mill. Mom, who was the daughter of the only college graduate in our family, my grandfather, Fee Moore, who preceded me to Samford University and then Howard College 34 years before I arrived there as a freshman, terrified I would flunk out, and thus started on a Monday morning after I graduated from high school on Friday night. from the absolutely rational position that if I flunked out that summer, no one would know, and I could go to a pipe shop in Anniston and go to work and nobody would be the wiser. And so Mom actually grew up in the family of one of the few college graduates of that generation, a high school principal who unfortunately was an alcoholic as well. Lost his job and wound up doing menial jobs for most of his life. In the middle of this story, there was a really good woman from a similar background to me. The unconditional support of a really good spouse is probably the single most important thing to any controversial activist public figure. If you don't have a wife like Gardy Flynt or a husband like Gardy Flynt, I can guarantee you the life I have lived will put you in a divorce court before you're done with it. It was Gardy who first read parts of the memoir and said, "What state are we moving to?" when this was published? In between Gardy and my mother and dad, there were these intervals. My religious conversion and the fact that the Bible became the most important book that I ever read. It is where I read about Gideon. Although not everyone in Alabama reads the Gideon story the same way I read it, which tells you a lot about Baptists. The second thing about my life that is pretty important in terms of who I am is that within the Bible I discovered the reason for my existence. It's listed somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,010 times. I'm now in the midst of Daniel and making my own reference. And I actually think Bono is a little underestimating the number of references. He's got 2,100. I think I'm going to go a little above that. Here are examples of the 1,300 I've already recorded. Isaiah 41:17. The wretched and the poor look for water and find none, but I, the Lord, will give them an answer. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. Or for a scholarship debater at Howard College in 1958, which is the way I paid my way through college, this one sort of bowled me over. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up, judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. It was as if I were Gideon, and that was the vision. During these middle years, I also had some wonderful mentors. Many were first in books and then ultimately people I came to know and love. My pastor, or at least the pastor of my church, the Reverend Charles Bell, came from an Anniston family whose father was president of Commercial National Bank. Life is curious about the intersections it gives us. Charlie Bell Banker owned the sharecrop farm where my illiterate grandfather planted cotton. Charlie Bell went to Howard College and then to Brown University and the Southern Baptist Seminary. And when he came back to pastor the church in which he grew up, he was not only a pacifist in the interwar years, but he voted for Norman Thomas 3 times, formed an interracial cooperative, and insisted that black ministers and leaders in Anniston come to the pastor's pastorium to eat with the pastor and enter the front door. That's Anniston, Alabama, in the 1930s. And later on, there was Will Campbell, Brother Will, as he prefers to be called. And there was Clarence Jordan, the founder of Koinonia Farms. And then perhaps the most influential of all of them, there was Harry Emerson Fawcett, pastor of Riverside Church. I'll get back to Riverside in time. They were all Baptists. And when people say, "Are you a Southern Baptist?" I say, "I'm a Baptist who lives in the South and an old-time traditional Baptist." Howard College taught me what an old-time traditional Baptist was like. That little Baptist college on the south side of Birmingham may have seemed like the safest place for Baptists conservatives to tuck away their children. But if they believed that, they had never studied with the religion faculty. Second question, how do we tell our stories? The subject matter, we all tell stories in different ways according to who we are and what we do for a living. I'm an historian. And I was shaped by a new way of telling the story of history. The 1960s, when I was in grad school, suggested that there might be a way different than the way of kings and presidents and congresses and titans of industry and intellectuals. There might be a history for people at the bottom, sharecroppers like my grandfather. I don't know why I never thought of it until I got to graduate school. My father was the greatest storyteller I ever heard. He didn't have a high school diploma. For hours and hours and hours, I sat with Dad. Just like Avondale, a mile down the road, was the place where the textile people lived, Woodlawn was the place where the railroad yard people lived. And they all went to Woodlawn High School. Woodlawn was their working class, blue-collar high school. Some years after going to Samford University on the faculty, Dr. Wright asked me if I would head the Woodrow Wilson Foundation program for the college. And I did so, and the first major report I received was an e-report locating those high schools in each state which historically had produced the most Woodrow Wilson Fellows in the state. At the time, this was the most prestigious award in American colleges, save Rhodes Scholars. So this was the creme de la creme of those who finished college and won Woodrow Wilson Fellowships and went off to get their PhDs. Predictably, the #1 high school in Alabama in the late 1960s in the history of the Woodrow Wilson program was Sidney Lanier High School in Montgomery. An all-white high school, basically from Cloverdale kids, a wonderful high school, one of the best high schools in America. The second largest producer of Woodrow Wilson scholars in Alabama was Woodlawn High School, right next door to where you sit. You don't limit the vision of people by where they come from or where they live. It's been such a great joy to write the history of those people. Next, there is the delivery strategy for telling my story. There are many ways to tell the story. Every time I taught Alabama history at Auburn, I told the story. I never will forget the lecture on the Alabama Constitution, Lenora, because it was the only place all year long that no matter the complexion of the racial composition of the class, or the gender composition of the class, or the political affiliation of the class, or the ideological preference of the class, it is the only single day when at the end of the class the student said, "What kind of idiots tolerate the persistence of this system to govern the state?" And sometimes I told the story in way too many books with way too many pages, but sometimes you think that if you just hit people over the head often enough, they'll get the message. But the most important work I've done, Ralph Cook, is actually to take this message out of classrooms and off the pages of books into how many hundreds, or perhaps now thousands, it is, of Kiwanis clubs and Rotary clubs and junior leagues and Baptist churches and churches of God and Christ and all the other venues of 50 years of doing this. I never will forget when Monroe Lerner at Johns Hopkins called after reading Dixie's Forgotten People in 1969 and saying, "I don't know you, but I really want to talk to you because we are forming a committee for the socio-economically disadvantaged in the American Cancer Society. And we started off with, I think, the wrong paradigm. We started off with a representative of African Americans, a representative of Asian Americans, a representative of Hispanic Americans, a representative of Native Americans, and we've been working for a year now. And I read your book, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, I'm not sure poverty and mortality rates from poverty have anything at all to do with ethnicity. I would like for you to come on the board, and I would like for you to lead us in a new direction in our research, where we assume that the issue is poverty, not ethnicity. And it's interesting that after 10 years now, if you read the research of the American Cancer Society, what they're saying is, women die of breast cancer because they do not have insurance. They get no early screening. And it makes no difference whether they're African Americans living in inner city Miami, or whether they're white Americans living in Lawrence County, Alabama. The statistics are exactly the same. And then the second stage of this activism was when Gordon Chamberlain, a Methodist minister, social worker, who had been a staff member at Riverside Baptist, or now Riverside Church, not Baptist Church, in New York City, pastored by Harry Emerson Fossey, retired. In his retirement, he moved to North Carolina, and he called Will Bailey at Auburn, and Will was president of the university, Church of Christ London. And he said, Will, I want to put together a poverty project that will help educate Alabamians through their churches and their universities so we can educate a new generation that will not lead us down the road we've been on before. He wrote a masterful book, On Whom We Depend, which suggested that perhaps the most important person in every community in America is the garbage man. Think what your community would be like if all of a sudden one day all the garbage men disappeared. He was a compelling, charismatic man who, before his death, asked Will Bailey and Earl Potts and Eugene Hawkins and I to begin the Alabama Poverty Project. So here we are, long after he died, but planted that seed in fertile soil. Then there was the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, on which I served for 6 years. The Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation is an interesting paradigm for Alabama. Half the members of the board are family members of the Mary Reynolds Babcock family, one of the largest tobacco companies, Reynolds Tobacco Company in America. Whether this is a guilt expiation or whether this is, I think, a deep commitment to social justice, they created a $100 million foundation that is the largest foundation in the world concerned about and dedicated to the eradication of poverty in the South. What did I learn a lot? Not just about Alabama, but about what happens on the Rio Grande, what happens in the Indian reservations in New Mexico, and the fact that the largest contiguous poor counties in America are in Appalachia and the Ozarks, where it's white, in the traditional southern cotton belt, where it's black, in the Rio Grande Valley, where it's Hispanic, and in New Mexico and the Southwest, where it's Native American. And then there were all the rest, Voices for Alabama's Children, Child Caring Foundation, the Blue Cross Blue Shield, Alabama Rise, Birmingham Community Minister. And all of a sudden you realize, it dawns on you like some great clap of divine thunder. Wayne, how could you have missed this? In a state where the leaders have no vision, either the state fails or ordinary people take the place of what once upon a time were leaders. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that all these ordinary people who rally within small communities across this state, like the blind men with a proverbial elephant, finding one part of this huge problem and doing what